Welcome back to Quick Book Looks. Today we're reading Christmas, a biography by Judith Flanders. It goes over some of the traditions, history, culture that many people have about Christmas. Chapter 1. The Bible is reticent on the birth of Christ. The Nativity is mentioned only in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. Luke was probably written around 80 CE, Matthew perhaps a decade later. Both may well have relied on a common source, for some details of their stories are identical. Luke describes how a census obliges Joseph to travel to Bethlehem, the city from which his family originates. There, Mary gives birth and her son lies in a manger, although there is no mention of a stable. An angel announces the birth to shepherds in the field, who hurry to see the child. In Matthew, in the reign of Herod, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, as though this were his parents' permanent place of residence. Unnumbered, unnamed wise men from the east follow a star, no brighter in this telling than any other, bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the house where the child lies. In the later non canonical proto Gospel of James, probably written towards the end of the 2nd century CE, Mary gives birth in a cave beneath a star that shines more brightly than the rest. Historically, as is well known, much of the story as we have it is problematic. There was a census carried out in 6 CE, but that was 10 years after the death of Herod, while there is no record of any census that obliged people to return to their place of ancestral origin to be counted. Further, the census enumerated property owners. If Joseph owned property, why weren't he and his wife able to lodge there? And even if Joseph had to be counted, why did his pregnant wife go too, when women were not included in censuses? If Mary gave birth in December, and there is no mention in the Bible nor in any early church writing of the date of Christ's birth, why were the sheep still in the fields in the winter months, when they should have been taken into the village for warmth? Moving from historical plausibility, it is likely that these writings made no reference to the Nativity because birthdays carried little religious significance in the early church. The important day was the day of baptism, the day of religious rather than physical birth. From the 2nd century, the Eastern Church marked 6th January as Epiphany, a Greek word meaning showing forth, indicating the day that Christ's divinity was revealed to man, and at least among some Egyptian Christians, the day was understood to mark Christ's baptism, although we have no knowledge of why that date was chosen. Constantine the Great extended tolerance to Christianity in the Roman Empire in 313. The establishment of Christmas as a church festival followed not long after. The earliest evidence we have for a celebration of Christ's birth is when Julius I, Bishop of Rome, decreed that Christ's nativity was to be observed on the 25th of December. Even so, from the start, Christmas seemed determined to break away from religion. Sometime before his death in 389, Gregory of Nazianzus, Archbishop of Constantinople, found it necessary to warn against the dancing and feasting to excess that were occurring on the holy day. Nobody issues warnings about things that aren't happening, so we can therefore assume that, only 30 years after it was first mentioned, Christmas was already being spent as a day of secular pleasure. And so it continued. By the mid-7th century, Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury, was reminding his followers that while it was fine to eat well at Christmas, the church frowned on gluttony. It is difficult not to conclude that many were indulging on that day. But why 25th of December? According to biblical scholars' calculations, based on the Gospels and other church writings, 17th April, 29th May, and 15th September are all more likely dates. The choice of 25th December seems instead to have been tied to the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. No convincing evidence of winter solstice celebrations in pagan Europe have survived. Instead, the first instance of such celebrations that we know of was in Roman times, with 3 festivals clustered around this date. Saturnalia, when religious offerings were made to Saturn, the god of agriculture, began on 17th of December and lasted for 7 days. Work ceased, shops closed, gifts of candles were given, and gambling, eating, and drinking prevailed. This holiday was followed by Calends, a secular civic New Year festival, officially from 1st to 3rd of January, but often unofficially continuing to 5th of January. Buildings were decorated with greenery, and people ate, drank, and watched races and processions, while small tokens, wreaths and garlands, or lamps inscribed "Happiness in the New Year" were exchanged. Libanius, a pagan Greek philosopher, described the Calends celebration of the 4th century, and they already sound familiar, featuring carousels and well laden tables, abundance for the rich and for the poor, better food than usual. It was a time of spending. People are not only generous towards themselves, but also toward their fellow men. There is also a strong element of society turned upside down as masters waited on their slaves and senators dressed as plebeians. By the 6th century, wrote one church father, these topsy turvy traditions had prevailed, the heathen reversing the order of all things, not just masters and servants trading places, but even men dressing as women. As with Gregory 2 centuries before, he too worried that the majority of men on those days became slaves to gluttony and riotous living, and raved in drunkenness and impious dancing. Between Saturnalia and the Calends came the celebration of the solstice. By the 1st century, Mithraism had spread from Middle East to become the most widely practiced religion in the Roman Empire. Yet, despite its prevalence, we know little about it today. The central event is speculated to have been the slaying of a sacred bull by the god Mithras, probably a spring fertility ceremony. The birth of Mithras, however, was marked at the winter solstice when, on the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birth of the unconquered sun, Mithras emerged from his birthplace in a cave, witnessed by 2 shepherds. By the 3rd century, Sol Invictus was the main god of the empire, and Dies Natalis his primary festival, which now began to assimilate many of the Calend traditions. This merging of holiday customs continued after Christianity became the established religion of Rome in 380. When the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival of Sol Invictus, they resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day. In other words, 25th December was chosen because it was already the commemoration of a sacred figure's birth. By the end of the 4th century, Eastern Christians in Constantinople were also celebrating Christmas on 25th December rather than Epiphany on 6th January, as were Christians in Gaul. The holiday itself now expanded. In 567, the Council of Tours made the days between Christmas and Epiphany into a single holiday, which was confirmed by Alfred the Great in 877 in Wessex. His law code named the 12 days a general holiday when even servants supposedly did no work. In Northern Europe, too, there were markers of the year end. Most Germanic languages contain some form of the word Yule, meaning midwinter. The Venerable Bede, in circa 730, claimed that the ancient Britons called December and January Yule or Yule, but in the British Isles from the 7th century, Yule was used to mean Christmas. The Old English word "Goal" had derived from the Old Norse "Jol". Although today in Scandinavia Jol means Christmas, originally it merely meant festivities, and we know little of these Norse ceremonies or beliefs. There may have been some form of ancestor worship to mark the return of the dead, a not uncommon idea as the sun waned and the old year died. Some said this was the day when, in various northern European legends, the Wild Hunt, that army of the dead, rode across the sky with their baying hellhounds led by Odin or Wotan on his eight-legged horse Sleipnir. Or it may have been a festival following the harvest and autumn slaughter, which was always the annual time for beer brewing. The older oral traditions, recorded in the 13th century saga of the Icelandic bard Snorri Sturluson, describes a midwinter festival of feasting and drinking when the king drank Jol or drank Yule. Bonfires and candles or burning logs, as well as greenery, may have been part of the observances. We simply don't know. By 960, King Haakon of Norway had Christianized the day, decreeing that Yule was to be marked on 25th December to coincide with the Christian festivities. What can be said with certainty is that in the Christian tradition, from the early days through the Middle Ages, many of the Christmas ecclesiastical developments were a matter less of religious liturgy than of entertainment. By the 11th century in France, a star was hung over the altar for an Epiphany play that was incorporated into the Mass, and the story of the Magi, of Herod, the massacre of the innocents, and the flight into Egypt were acted out. In the 12th century, English churches also staged these plays, and as late as the 16th century, churches' records show that painted and gilded stars continued to be made. Another form of theater originated with Francis of Assisi, who in 1223 first produced a replica of a stable with a manger, an ox, and an ass. This became popular across much of Western Europe, as did in the Rhineland Kinderwagen or cradle rocking, services where a life-size cradle with a Christ child was rocked by the altar to the rhythm of Wagenlieder or cradle songs. In the Netherlands, two cradles, one on the altar, one near the congregation, were decorated with little bells that rang as they were rocked. A distinctive seasonal feature in England was the miracle play. These plays were religious in content, but unlike Epiphany plays, they were in English, not Latin, and unlike Kinderwagen or the nativity scenes, they were produced under the patronage of civic guilds, not the church. We know little about the early plays, but from at least 1392, guilds in Coventry staged the pageant of the Shearmen and the Tailors, which recounted the events of the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Adoration of the Kings, the flight into Egypt, and the massacre of the innocents. A fragment of surviving stage directions indicates how the drama played out. Here, Herod rages in the pageant cart and also in the street. One remnant of the topsy-turvy nature of the calends re-emerged in the European craze for the Feast of Fools when minor clergy took over the roles of their seniors between Christmas and New Year. There was no gentle event. Priests and clerks dance in the choir dressed as women, pander, pimps, or minstrels. They sing wanton songs. They play at dice at the altar. They cense with stinking smoke from the soles of old shoes. They run and leap through the church with indecent gesture and verses scurrilous and unchaste. Over time, these lewd games were replaced by a more innocent version of the serpent as master inversion, this time controlled by the masters. Bishops, cloisters who took on the bishop's role were elected for the holiday cycle on 6th of December, the name day of St. Nicholas, patron saint of children, and they officiated especially on 28th December, the feast of the Holy Innocents. The first bishop boy we know of was in St. Gallen in what is today Switzerland in 911, and that this social upheaval was approved from above is clear. Both King Conrad I of Germany and the Bishop of Constance attended services on the day the boy preached, the king attempting to distract him and his child attendants by rolling apples down the aisle. The boys apparently turned a dignified blind eye to the misbehavior of their rowdy adult congregants. Boy bishops were especially popular in England, many churches keeping miniature chasubles and staffs and albs for the use of their miniature clergy. Ultimately, Henry VIII took a dislike to the custom and it was banned in England in 1541. Queen Mary restored it, but it failed to outlast her, although schoolboys continue to enjoy St. Nicholas's Day as a holiday. Elsewhere, it survived far longer. Many Swiss districts had a boy bishop as late as the mid-19th century. Churches saw more solemn pageantry on Christmas Day, but it was no less theatrical. Charlemagne was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day, 800, and the holiday remained a favorite one for kingly entrances and exits. Edward the Confessor was buried in Westminster Abbey on Epiphany 1066, while the coronation of his successor, William I, took place the following Christmas Day. At Epiphany 1300, Edward I offered the church a gift of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, a king marking the Day of the Three Kings, a tradition that continued in England for another 6 centuries. The holiday impulse in courts across Europe, however, was primarily secular. Courtly feasting in Germany in the 11th century saw guests singing secular songs, although at one of these feasts they were countered by liturgical chanting from the shocked clergy present. Welsh and Irish courts also had winter feasts from around the same date, and soon it was a time of feasting for all who could afford it. In Germany, especially, year-end fairs became regular events, with one in Kempen being established from at least 1461 to supply these lavish entertainments. In England, rulers intermittently attempted to curb the excess of the period, although with little success. Around 1100, Henry I issued a proclamation declaring the year-end of time of fasting, not feasting. Yet by the reign of King John, courtly Christmas feasts had become mind-bogglingly elaborate. On Christmas Day, 1213, the king's household and guests consumed 27 hogshead of wine, 400 head of pork, 3,000 fowl, 15,000 herring, 10,000 eels, 100 pounds of almonds, 2 pounds of spices, and 66 pounds of pepper. 200 years later, Edward III tried again, passing laws restricting the meals on 7 of the holiday's 12 days to 2 courses, with a limit of 2 kinds of meat per course. The recipes that have survived indicate that this seasonal excess was not confined to the courts, but was also indulged in by the prosperous. One recipe for a Christmas pie from 1394 includes pheasant, hare, capon, partridge, pigeon, and rabbit, livers, hearts and kidneys, and meatballs, all spiced and sauced and cooked with pickled mushrooms before being baked into a pastry case made craftily in the likeness of a bird's body, including a great tail complete with feathers. This was the most remarkable because from at least the 5th century, Advent had officially been a church-designated period of penitence and fasting like Lent, with Christmas Eve a major fast day on which meat, cheese, and egg were forbidden. Yet the late 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight indicates that this was often honored more in the breach. There the castle guests are served. A feast of fish, some baked in bread, some browned over flames, some boiled or steamed, some stewed in spices and subtle sauces to tantalize his tongue. 4 or 5 times he called it a feast, and the courteous company happily cheered him along. On penance plates you dine, there's better board to come. That they are eating fish from penance plates makes clear that this is a fast day meal, but otherwise the notion of fasting is barely observed. That feasting overcame all prohibitions is unsurprising. The European agricultural year almost dictated it. After the autumn harvest, grain was stored, fruit and vegetables preserved, followed by what the 16th century poet farmer Thomas Tussayer called slaughter time, when the husbandman's feasting began. In the colder parts of Europe, St. Martin's Day was the traditional time for slaughter, and feasting followed hard behind it, with St. Martin's geese or swine in Germany, geese in Denmark, and Martelmas beef in England. In wine growing regions, too, St. Martin's Day was when the new wine was ready. In England, seasonal drinking was given an archaic air, a sense of tradition to justify it. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain told the tale of the 5th century leader Vortigern, who was invited to drink with the toast, Lord King Vauxhall, more correctly, was hail, or Lord King, your health, to which the response was, drink ale. The story was almost entirely fabricated, and the parts that weren't were anachronistic by half a millennium. Nonetheless, this legendary Wassail was transformed into wassail and became part of the holiday tradition. In the 14th century, the rich began to prize special wassail bowls of precious metal, using them for formal toasts. The poor carried humbler bowls from door to door, drinking to their superiors in exchange for food or drink. As with the Calends, by the Middle Ages, the holiday period had become a time of gambling and gifts. In many places, dicing and cards were limited to the Christmas season. In others, gaming was legal year round, but respectable people indulged only during the holiday. In one area in France, more than two-thirds of the court cases concerning gambling occurred between October and February. In Castile, the royal monopoly on gambling was lifted on 25th and 26th December, so all could indulge. In England, legislation permitted holiday gambling. By 1461, a law prohibited nobles from playing dice or cards in their own homes except during the 12 days. 50 years later, artificer or craftsman, husbandman, apprentice laborers, servants as husbandry, journeyman or servant of artificers, or any serving man were all banned from playing at the tables, tennis, dice, cards, bowls, clash, quoiting, logating, or any other unlawful game except at Christmas. With the 12 days considered a single holiday, the Calends' New Year's gifts become a Christmas custom. In Gawain and the Green Knight, the courtiers shout, Noel, Noel, then New Year's gifts, the knight cried next, as they pressed forward to offer their presents. These knights were offering gifts to their lord. Small gifts were sometimes given among friends, but more frequent were gifts designed to reinforce the social hierarchy, always given upwards, from knight to lord, from lord to ruler. In 15th and 16th century England, account books from the households of the great all indicate that gift giving was routine, although we don't know how widespread the habit was lower down the social scale. In 1575, the soldier and poet George Gascoigne wrote that tenants traditionally gave their landlords capons at Christmas as part of a series of obligatory year-round gifts. And when the tenants come to pay their quarter's rent, they bring some fowl at midsummer, a dish of fish in Lent, at Christmas a capon, at Michaelmas a goose, and somewhere else at New Year's tide for fear their lease flies loose. In Gwaine, after the gifts were given, the knights and their ladies danced and drank for 3 days. Some great houses hired professional musicians, but more commonly, the entertainments were produced by and for the guests. In the 15th century, a death in the family reduced one landowner's household to a most unseasonably quiet, with no disguising, nor harping, nor looting, nor singing, nor none loud disporting, but playing at the tables and chess and cards. Thus, by the close of the Middle Ages, for much of Europe, Christmas was certainly a religious festival, but while the Church was included new traditions to mark the day, it never succeeded in overwhelming the secular pastimes, and Christmas was primarily a time of feasts, where kinfolk do resort together, bringing or sending presents mutually, food, family, and giving. If you're curious about more Christmas traditions or why we do the things we do, please check out Christmas: A Biography by Judith Flanders. Thank you for joining me and hope you join me again.